Now, the Morlan-Pantyfedwen annual lecture possesses a long and exalted history. The lecture series was originally convened in 1961 under the auspices of what is now called the Pantyfedwen Trust, the charity created by Sir David James, a London Welsh businessman with strong connections with Ceredigion. And the aims of the charity have been to promote religion, particularly ecumenical work in Wales, as well as supporting other kinds of cultural activity in various communities across Wales as well. And of course, the lecture series symbolises one of these commitments, namely to provide prominent scholars such as our guest speaker this evening, Professor Linda Woodhead, with the opportunity to deliver a lecture on any theme relating to religion. And since 2015, the Pantyfedwen lecture has been renamed the Morlan-Pantyfedwen lecture in recognition of the collaboration and the strong links between the Pantyfedwen Trust and the Morlan Centre in Aberystwyth. And to give a bit of background, the Morlan Centre was formed in 2005 to explore the links between faith and culture. And it has grown since then to be a significant cultural and religious institution, both here in Aberystwyth and more broadly in Wales as a whole. And you could argue that the scope of Morlan's work is ever expanding. We've got some people here attending from Canada this evening, and I guess Zoom is enabling the Morlan Centre and the Morlan-Pantyfedwen lecture to go global. Ond wrth gwrs, dych chi ddim wedi dod yma heno i wrando na un siarad, mae'n fraint i mi gyflwyno'n siaradwr gwadd ni heno, sef yr Athro Linda Woodhead o Brifysgol Caerhirfryn. Mae'r Athro Woodhead yn arbenigo mewn astudiaethau crefyddol a chymdeithaseg crefydd yn ogystal. Ac yn benodol, mae wedi astudio y newid crefyddol sydd wedi digwydd ers yr 80au ym Mhryden. Yn enwedig falle y ffaith bod ni'n teimlo nawr bod ni'n rhan o ryw fath o gymdeithas ôl Gristnogol. A rili dyna yw ffocws i Darlith i heno, lle mae'n trafod arwyddocâd y syniad o werthoedd, yn hytrach na chrefydd fel y cyfryw falle, fel sail ar gyfer hunaniaeth pobl ifanc ym Mhryden. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker this evening, Linda Woodhead, MBE, Distinguished Professor of Religion at Lancaster University. She's a world-leading expert on the sociology of religion, having examined a number of themes really that are highly relevant to the work of both the Pantyfedwen Trust and the Morlan Centre. She's written extensively and published numerous books on themes as varied as how individuals' beliefs shape their lives and the variation that might exist in those beliefs, and how and why those beliefs might also change over time. And as part of her work, she studied Christianity in its different forms, as well as other forms of spirituality, Neo-Hinduism, Islam as well. But as well as writing extensively about these themes, she's worked hard to engage with the public and policymakers as well in debates about religion. So for instance, she co-founded the Westminster Faith Debates with former Home Secretary Charles Clarke in 2011. And she's also a regular contributor to national newspapers in the UK, as well as to BBC Radio 4, including contributing to the Thought for the Day slot. I was also intrigued to see on Wikipedia, where I do some of my best research, that she was invited to attend the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2013. And Wikipedia didn't say whether you actually went and attended the forum, but it all sounded very glamorous in any case. Now, one theme that's of special interest to her, and the one that provides really the backdrop to tonight's lecture, is the increasing secularization of society in the UK, witnessed in developments such as the growing significance of no religion as a social category, along with the increased importance of values maybe, as opposed to religion as a source of identity and belonging especially for millennials. And we're really looking forward to hear what you have to say about this important matter this evening, Professor Woodhead. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Professor Woodhead, who will be discussing the topic Understanding Young Millennials, Values, Identities and Belonging. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for the invitation, which I was delighted to get. And I looked at the list of very distinguished previous speakers and felt very honoured to be here. And I'd like to thank the organisers for helping me think through the topic and entice me to speak about this topic, and Gwenan for all her efficiency. This is actually the first time I've spoken on this topic, even though I've been researching it with other people now for about 5 years. And the book, it's being written up as a book, which is going to come out in the autumn. I mean, just under a year from now, and that's why the recording can't be made public before then. So this is just a little sneak preview of the findings, but in fairness to my co-authors and the publisher, it's just for us. So it's just for us tonight. It'll be made public later on where everything's made public. So I'm very delighted that this is the forum in which I can start to share some of these findings from the research that we've been doing. So as Rhys Jones said, I'm going to start with I'll have 2 parts, and in the first part I'm going to introduce some big themes about this generation and who they are, and then in the second part I'll focus more specifically on what religion means or doesn't mean for them. So let me first be clear about who I'm talking about by young millennials. Sometimes this is the generation that is called Generation Z, the one that came after Generation X. I'm a very old Generation X, and before me are the boomers. So then come the millennials, but increasingly people are saying and thinking, and we agree with them, that there's something distinctive about young millennials. So what I'm talking about this evening is people who were born from 1995 onwards. So these are the undergraduates at my university. They're people going through college now. Some are now just starting employment, and some are doing their A-levels. It's that kind of a generation that I'm talking about. And no one knows quite why generations start and form an identity amongst themselves and a sense of shared identity, but often it's some shared experiences. And it may be that this young millennial group, post-millennials, Generation Z, are the ones who have been born since the internet was just normal. In 1995, that was when Windows 95 came along, when smartphones were just starting to become really common, when the digital was just, it's been part of the milieu, it's the water they've swum in their whole lives. And they had mobile devices with them when they were teenagers. So that may be part of what gives them a distinct sense of who they are. So that's what I'm talking about. And this is why I know about it, because we decided to study this generation in depth. And we is 4 of us, 4 academics, although Roberta Katz, that's the team at the top. Roberta was also an administrator at Stanford University for part of her life. And in fact, she worked in Silicon Valley in her younger life as a lawyer. So she's had many roles, but she was our digital expert as well as being an anthropologist. And then 2 other colleagues who are at Oxford and myself. So we've done a very collaborative project here, and we were funded to do it very generously by an American foundation called the Knight Foundation and by a centre at Stanford University. So we worked on this together for quite a long time, and it's exciting to now see it coming together. And this is what we did. We've all got different specialisms, and we deliberately gathered together so that we could bring those together to give a sort of holistic portrait of a generation. For example, we have to have a historian, otherwise everyone thinks, oh, this generation is completely different. But the historian spends their life saying, no, they're not, they're just like, or everyone thought like this in 1820. So we needed a historian and an anthropologist. And we needed a linguist because social media and their language online was such an important part of this. and I'm a sociologist of religion. So over the last few years, we've carried out a lot of interviews on three college campuses. Our study is just of college post-millennials, which is about half of this generation. It would be fantastic to do another study of the non-college educated, but we could only do one thing at a time. So ours is just of the college students, and we took 3 campuses for the interviews. One is a community college in California called Foothill. One is Lancaster University in the northwest of England, where I teach, and one was Stanford University in California, where Roberta was an administrator. And we also did 2 representative surveys. Those interviews, of course, are only of a snapshot, if you like, but we did 2 surveys of the whole population, the general population of 18 to 25-year-olds in both America and Britain. And Sarah, the linguist, scraped a lot of the language off their most popular social media sites and formed a corpus or a data bank of that we could also analyse. The aim is really simple. We want to understand what the French got that lovely word, mentalité, of this generation through their own words and images. And just to reiterate, this is the college educated half of that population. But our surveys also, they surveyed everybody. So we can see where the college educated might have a different attitude from the non-college. Actually, the differences aren't as great as you might imagine. So now let me run through, I mean, let me just say, before I start, generational studies, why do them? And are there such a thing as a generation? We talked about this a lot ourselves. I mean, the reason we thought it would be interesting was because we thought there's something really interesting about this generation, and not like when we were students or even students 10 years ago. And then thinking about, is it worth studying generations? It can be very, when you think about it, human beings have always thought in generational terms. Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes says, one generation passeth away and another cometh. In the Iliad, as our peers, people shaped by common experiences, we distinguish ourselves from the older ones, and quite soon we distinguish ourselves from our generation we found does have a strong sense of their distinctness. So in what does that distinctness consist? The thing I want to start by saying that we found is that for them, identity is very important, and the uniqueness of their individual identity. My colleague Jane called it fine-grained identity. She was thinking about grains of timber. You know, each one is completely unique. Each person is unique, and it's terribly important for young people to be aware of who you are and be able to articulate who you are. Well, one part of your uniqueness is your gender, and this has become ever more complex, and it's very central for how this generation think about themselves. Now, the word unicorn is very popular, and it of course says something that's unique. And this little diagram explains how they think about their gender identity. You've got an identity, something you're sort of born with, given, but it's also how you express it, and it can be feminine, masculine, or other. There's also what people said you were when you were born, the doctors and your relatives, and you might not agree with them as you get older. And then that's different again from sexuality, who you're physically attracted to, and romantic orientation, who you're emotionally attracted to. So young people are thinking about who they are on all these different planes, and they don't all go together. You know, when older generations, they all went together. You were a heterosexual man or a heterosexual woman. It was a package. Now that's come apart. And so there's this much greater uniqueness that you have to find out your own unique gender and sexual identity to start with. But that's not all. You also think about what your race and ethnicity is. You can't just be blind to that now. You have to think about your white privilege if you're white. You have to think about your distinctive ethnic and cultural inheritance and the language you have, something in Wales that you already are very aware of. You should be clear about how much privilege you have and how that might set you apart. Religion is a less important part. There's not quite the same sort of imperative to be clear on your religious orientation. I'll come back to religion, as I said. But also who you are is about what you're passionate about, what you love, what you're a fan of, maybe your own things that you do or create, your creative abilities or hobbies or all those sorts of things. And your vulnerabilities. For this generation, they're very much more open about talking about their mental health issues, their anxiety, their depression, their needs, their wants, their limitations. This is seen as a mark of authentic identity, that you can talk about those things too. I'm just going to give you a few quotes to give you a sort of inside taste, because the way we wanted to do this research was in their own words. I'm not going to read them out, which is very boring, but I think you can probably read for yourselves. So I'll just let you have a look at these. And I've picked ones I think sum up a lot of what's important to them. So see how this person has thought through, they're only 18 or 19, but they've thought through. They're Black, they're queer, they're first generation low income. That means first generation at college from a low income family. But also they're a Christian. I mean, they sort of put it lower down, don't they? Also, I'm a Christian and I'm a tennis fan. And then they say, well, I think it all fits together really well. That's who I am. And they can tell you, this generation can really communicate. Partly this is because of the digital. They've been doing online quizzes about who they are and what horoscope sign and will they, who are they suited to. They've done these online quizzes, multiple choice things their whole lives, but they're very articulate about who they are. They're also very aware that who they are either advantages or disadvantages of them, or some of those identities advantage them. Going to Stanford advantages me, but being trans makes me vulnerable to prejudice. So they're very aware of the power ramifications of their identity. Now, that might sound very individualistic, saying that identity is so important to them, and it is. And it is individualistic, of course it is. It's about your unique individuality. But what we found, to our surprise, was that they see this as absolutely tied up with finding who your community is, who the people are that you feel at home with, where you really belong. And you can't really find yourself without finding where you belong. And those sort of go together. And it's online communities, of course, that make it possible for them to find exactly the sort of community that fit, or communities, plural, that fits with their identity. Here's an example I've just, imagine that you are, okay, I'll go back. Imagine that you are a Christian, but you're transgender, you're transitioning from male to female, let's say, and your own church can't accept that, so you don't feel you can be yourself in your own church. What do? You go online and you look for people like you, and you might find a Facebook group or a Reddit, the different platforms where you can find these sub-communities. Or when you Google, I just Googled it, trans and Christianity, and here you find a site looking for a place where you can talk about your faith and your gender. This is transgender, gender expansive Christians. And they've put their values here very clearly: committed to growing our faith, supporting each other, and healing our world. So then you start and you find on this journey, you think, oh yes, I think I really am. You clarify your gender identity and your faith. And then you think, I don't really belong to this group. They all seem very, very evangelical. So then you go and find a Catholic group that's more like who you are, but then they're a bit too liberal. So then you find them, you can find, by the end of the search, you'll find a group of people that you feel you can be yourself with. And in the process, you find out who you are. They have that ability in a way that was much harder when you lived in the small community and you didn't have access to nearly as many people. Now, this word fam, Sarah, our linguist, found this is very, very important for them, and it's an abbreviation, a shortening of family. And it's a word they use a lot. My fam is your people you feel really at home with, your intimate community. And it's become, you know, almost, I mean, it's not a biological family necessarily. It might be, but probably not, as this quotation explains. So notice that if the support you used to get from your biological family can come now from your peer group at college, or your, you know, people you find online, those communities or whatever, that diminishes the importance of the traditional family. That's not to say that those families aren't important to most of them. Your family doesn't accept, to cut off relationships and find another fam where you are accepted for who you are. And with that, I think we found that out, but they don't date in the way that we used to. They're not looking for a life distant thought. Again, this point about individuality, yes, they about what they rely on, but they do talk to their parents, they do talk to their friends, and then look where science, religion, siblings. Again, what do you do when you feel overwhelmed? Fix it myself is the first answer, or retreat into myself. But then also about a quarter to say reach out to friends, and the same, reach out to family. And here's this quote to sum up. You are in those sorts of organizations. And they don't like big leaders. We asked them what sort of leadership they prefer. Look, one leader, they don't like that at all. They like collaborative, shared, cooperative forms of leadership where everyone has a say. And something that sums them up is their love of memes. Memes are these little things you transmit really quickly and easily on Facebook or on your phone, send to one another to amuse each other. It sums up, they're very ironic. They deal with life with humor, with irony. They make these little pictures with words to sort of bind together the fam, those who share their values and ideas, make them laugh and laugh off things that they don't like. So memes, meme culture, memes are absolutely part of how they communicate with each other and what they see as distinctive to them. Okay, so now a bit more on religion. Well, I think it should be very clear from what I've said already that this generation has a very strong set of values, a very strong ethic, and it centers around these things: live your life, live it fully, live it authentically, realize who you are, and support others to do the same and make a positive difference in the world. So their ethic is very, it's very central to them. They articulate it very clearly. It runs through very much of what they do. It gives, I think, orientation for this generation, perhaps in a way that religion used to for earlier generations. They are, they are quite a significant proportion of activists. We asked them on the survey, and about a third said they'd self-describe as activists. Probably more are involved in some way, even if it's just online, in a cause they care about. Here are the big concerns they have. Environment, very high for them, more in the UK. That was different by race. Non-white people in both countries were more concerned than white people about crime and violence. They often put crime and violence higher than environment, probably because it's more their communities are more directly affected by that. But inequality, economic inequality, global as well as in your own country, concerns them. Global violence, unrest, war concerns them. And quite a few, well, it was multicultural samples, so they had relatives in areas affected by violence around the world. The economy, and that's interesting because they're all pretty clear that they're not going to be better off than their parents, and that this promise of endless economic growth has spluttered out, and they're the ones who are really going to suffer from that more than previous generations. Will they be able to afford a house? Will they be able to get a well-paying job or any job? They're really in a bad situation, and of course things like COVID make it worse. So there's some of their concerns, and some of them are moral concerns as well as personal concerns. There are tensions in this value system. There's a tension between wanting to be kind and respectful, which means cancelling people who aren't. That's got that term cancel culture attached to it now, and valuing free speech. They do value both things, and they try to hold them together. And between being really aware that self-care is important and putting your own needs first, that's what you're responsible for, but then sometimes that isn't going to help the group that you're working with. And how do you balance those things? So religion comes, as I said, it's not the first thing they tend to talk about on identity. A few do, but not most. We know already from other research, this is my research from another project, if we look at the age group on the left-hand axis, under 20s and 20s, the orange bar is no religion, rather than, this is England and this is Great Britain. So rather than being Anglican or Roman Catholic or another church or faith, the majority of this generation say they have no religion. They don't identify as religious. And this is going to go on. We know this because if you're brought up with parents who are non-religious, as many of this generation are, then your children will be non-religious, and so it will go on. But it doesn't mean to say they're necessarily atheists. In fact, most probably aren't. If you look at the 20s and under 20s again, this is people who say there's definitely a God, probably a God, or don't know. So the blue, orange, grey, that's sort of believing or thinking maybe. Then the definite atheists are the pale blue on the right. So even if they say they're not religious, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are atheists. They don't like organised religion. Here's back to the don't like institutions, don't like hierarchy. It stands for many of the things they dislike. Hierarchical, intolerant in their view, sexist and homophobic very often, and boring. But they might be very negative, and they are in the way they often talk about religion. But many of them say they have some sense that, well, there's something good in there, and it's been corrupted by bad leaders, bad people. The whole religion package isn't in itself totally bad. And there's generally an openness and tolerance towards people of all faiths, and a view that, well, I'm not, I may not be a Hindu, or I might not even be religious, but I respect the fact that you are. That's a very common attitude. And there's great respect for people who are seen to be authentic in the way they live out their religious life. It's something that, yeah, it fits their words and who they are and what they do fits together. So there's a question about, if you're going to be religious, is it authentic to you? You can't just pretend. They're very suspicious of people who suddenly just declare they're a Native American. Is that actually part of your family history? Have you got a right to that identity? If you have, great. And then you can be really proud of your ethnic and religious heritage. Also, religious identity has to be explored and practiced. In my generation, you would just say, in England, you would just say, what's your religion? Don't know, C of E. It was just like you were born into it. It was part of the air that you breathed. That's become much, much less common for this generation. It's not really authentic if you just say you're something and you haven't really looked into it. made it part of your identity through a commitment. And a lot of the students we interviewed, when we asked them about religion, they said, well, my family's Sikh, but I haven't really had time to look into it, but I might look into it later in life when I've left college. There's a guy who studies this and he calls it the lockbox. They put it in a little lockbox and they think, I might get that out in the future. Here's a quote to sum up some of this. Someone thinking through what God means, not rejecting the concept, but giving it a really new twist. The creator. And what's creation? Well, it could be evolution, it could be Big Bang. What's behind that is God for this person. Quite a thoughtful response. Here's another one. I'm technically Hindu means, well, that's what my parents are and that's what my family is. You know, that's what I say I am if I tick a box. But I don't really practice it or know much about it. But then you're trying to. You think, well, I'll appropriate that part of my identity. Here's another one. This is a lockbox phenomenon. And this person didn't grow up in a religious family. They're a non-religious family. You know, I don't have enough knowledge about any of them. I think that is a very hard starting point for somebody. Where do you start if you weren't brought up with any? More and more for this, you have to remember, for this generation, it's very common to have zero experience of religion, except perhaps a little bit at school, and not even that in the USA. So where do you start? And then spiritual is a word that they use quite freely, generally fairly positively. This is a fairly common way of defining it. Something subjective, something that's about you. And for them, you know, this is interesting. For them, spirituality, because it's something empirical, something you work out through your own experience, it's different from religion, which is blind faith. So they see it somehow as something almost more scientific in that you work it out, it's empirical. Whereas religion is more irrational or superstitious, or you just commit to it. I love this quote. It makes the point that it was somebody in quite a Pentecostal church in America, and it was quite conservative in its teaching about, she was telling us about gay people. And so she says to God, you know, she doesn't agree with this anti-gay stuff. So she's not going to accept it, even if the Bible says it. So she says, I love you, God, but I have my beliefs. And her beliefs are that gay people are equal. So she's not going to take that part of the religion. So you get people in really quite a lot, you know, really orthodox, conservative Judaism or Islam or Christianity, but they maintain their own values, interestingly. They don't necessarily take on board everything they're told they should believe. See how important their values are. And just a footnote that there's things like tarot and astrology are very popular amongst young people at the moment. There are lots of apps on your phone that you can use, and they're seen as not really religious and not scientific either. They're in a sort of grey zone that interests people very much, is intriguing and open, and you can play about with it and learn things from it, and it's popular. So conclusion on all that, enormous diversity when it comes to religion, enormous diversity and growing diversity. It's very hard to, you know, give a pick. This isn't the trend, it's all going to be like this. People are making choices in their own ways and finding, as with identity, something that really works for them, whether religious, secular or spiritual.